The Wind at Major Creek, Chapter Number 1, The People of the Salmon. The wind in the Columbia River Gorge does not merely blow, it speaks. It's a language of pressure and release forged in the high desert of the east and compressed by the volcanic teeth of the Cascades until it howls through the basalt canyons. For 1,000 generations, the people of the river understood this language. They knew that when the wind shifted, the salmon were moving. They knew that when the clouds hung low over the sheer cliffs on the Oregon side, the river was shifting its mood. In the time before the white sails of the explorers, a young Klickitat scout named Tamsky stood on the promontory overlooking the confluence of the unnamed Roaring Creek, the one of the outsiders would one day call Major Creek, and the great wide gray-blue belly of the Columbia. Tamsky was not tall, but he was wide-shouldered, his muscles honed by the constant movement required to navigate the steep, treacherous embankments of the gorge. He wore a simple tunic of deerskin, supple and smelling of wood smoke, and the sharp, clean scent of the river. He was perched on a naturally occurring shelf of columnar basalt, a lookout that had been refined by his ancestors over centuries. They had moved the heavy stones, wedging them into a crescent shape that provided both a shelter from the cutting wind and a perfect vantage point over the river's main channel. To the west, the river narrowed, surging through the tight passage known as the Gateway. And to the east, the water broadened into a vast swirling expanse. Below him, the creek tumbled down in the series of white foam cascades, carving a jagged, dark wound into the earth before vanishing into the Columbia's massive current. Tamsky's job was simple yet profound. He was the eyes of the village. He leaned against a stone, his fingers tracing the smooth, cool surface of a petroglyph etched into the basalt. It was a depiction of a sturgeon, a reminder of the abundance the river provided. His people lived in a delicate balance with this place. They were not its masters, they were its guests. Every tool he carried, the Ascidian blade in his hip, the fishing spear latched to his back, was a testament to the stone and to the river. He looked down toward the sandy delta where the creek met the river. There, hidden among the ancient cottonwoods, lay the village. It was a cluster of tool mat lodges, their smoke rising in thin gray ribbons that the wind immediately shredded. He could hear the faint rhythmic thumping of stone pestles against the mortars, women grinding the camas root and dried berries. It was the sound of a living culture, a heartbeat that echoed the steady pulse of the river itself. He had been on the lookout since before the sun had cleared the eastern hills. His task today was to monitor the run. The water was cold, clear, and charged with the life force of the season. Soon the salmon would arrive in such numbers that the river would seem to boil with silver. As he scanned the horizon, Tamsky felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver, not from the wind, but from a shift in the air's quality. The birds, usually raucous in the trees below, had gone quiet. The eagles had typically circled the thermal currents near the cliffside, had drifted inland. He gripped the edge of his stone hideout. He had been trained to notice the slightest anomaly, a ripple in the water where no rock existed, a change in the pitch of the wind against the canyon walls. He saw them. At first, they looked like strange, long-bodied, watered creatures moving against the flow. They were too large to be canoes of the local tribes, and their movement lacked the grace of the cedar boats he was accustomed to. They were jagged, alien, and persistent. Tamsky's heart hammered against his ribs. He signaled to the village below, a series of sharp, bird-like whistles that cut through the roar of the water. He didn't know what these things were, but he knew they belonged to a world that did not know the language of their river. As the objects drew closer, the structure of the event became clear. There were two of them, heavy, clunky wooden structures laden with men who looked like pale, hair-covered creatures of a different spirit world. They carried long, strange sticks. They were staring at the cliffs with a mix of awe and hunger. Tamsky crouched lower, pulling his blanket of woven cedar bark tight around his shoulders. He was witnessing the end of the long silence. For millennia, the gorge had been a world defined by the river's cycle, the spring freshest, the summer heat, the fall harvest, the winter frost. It was a circle closed and perfect. But as those strange vessels passed the confluence of the creek, Tamsky felt the circle break. He watched them move on, driven by the current, heading toward the great falls of the Dalles. He knew then that the world was becoming a wider, more dangerous place. He thought of the village below, the fires, the children playing in the shallows, the elders who carried the songs of the mountains. He thought of stone sturgeon etched in the rock beneath his hand. He realized that he was the last of his kind to see the river as it had been since the time of the Great Spirit. He was a sentinel for a disappearing world. The sun began to slide behind the horizon, turning the river into a sheet of liquid copper. Tamsky stayed in his lookout long after the strangers had disappeared from view. He took a piece of charcoal from his pouch and, in the dim light, added a new mark to the rock, a jagged, irregular shape representing the strange, unbidden visitors. He knew with a sudden sinking certainty that he could not stop the tide that was coming. He could only witness it. He descended the cliffside, his feet finding the well-worn path through the lichen-covered rocks with a grace that only generations of familiarity could produce. As he reached the village, he saw the tension in the air, the word that traveled faster than the boats. The elders were gathered, their faces lit by the flickering orange glow of the evening fire. He sat among them, saying nothing at first. He reached into the pouch and pulled out a small, translucent shard of agate he had found earlier that day. He turned it over in his hand. It was beautiful, ancient, and indifferent to the turmoil of men. "They come from the sea," one of the elders whispered, his voice thin and raspy like dry leaves skittering over the rock, "and they do not know how to listen to the water." Tamsky looked toward the confluence. The creek was still singing a bright, clear melody that had not changed in an eternity, but in his mind he could hear the discordant rhythm of the future, the sound of iron on iron, the felling of trees, the carving of the earth. He looked at the children playing near the edge of the water. They were laughing, chasing each other through the tall grass, their minds occupied only with the present moment. He could not tell them of the boats. He would not burden them with the fear that had gripped his own heart. Instead, he stood and walked to the water's edge. He knelt and dipped his hands into the river, the cold shock of it grinding him. He washed the dust of the lookout from his face. The history of the gorge was not written in books. It was written in the water, in the stone, in the blood of the people who walked it. Tamsky understood that his own story was just one small fleeting ripple in an endless rushing current. That night, under a sky so thick with stars it felt as though one could reach up and brush them away, Tamsky did not sleep. He sat by the confluence, listening to the creek as it merged with the river. He felt the immense power of the geography, the basalt, the wind, the ancient restless pulse of the Columbia. And he knew that everything changes. The mountain falls, the river carves a new path, the people move on. But for one more night, the village was safe. The fire was bright. The salmon were wading in the deep pools, and the land remained for a few more heartbeats exactly as it was meant to be. He did not know that his descendants would be driven out, that the village would be scattered, that the very stones of his lookout would be bypassed by the iron rail, or that one day a man named El would walk his same ground, picking up the stone tools he had fashioned, wondering about the hands that had held them. He only knew that the river kept moving. It had no pity, it had no malice. It simply flowed, carrying the memories of all who lived upon its banks toward the vast, unknowable ocean. Tamsky stood up, brushed the earth from his knees, and looked up at the moon. He whispered a prayer to the water, a song of gratitude for the life he had lived, and a plea for the strength to face the unknown. The wind shifted. A cool draft came down from the peaks, bringing with it the promise of winter. Tamsky walked back to the lodge, his shadow long and thin against the earth. Behind him, the creek continued its eternal descent, a constant murmuring witness to the passing of time. The confluence waited, silent and immense, ready to receive whatever the future would bring, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of men, and the fleeting, fragile lives of those who dared to call this wild place home. Again, The Wind at Major Creek, chapter number 1. This is a fictional history written about a piece of property that my grandpa Elwood E. Kitchen once owned.